All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Power Place Wednesday webinar. My name is CJ. I'm the Director of Training and Placemaking with Grow Smart Rhode Island. Super excited to be here this morning. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks to our panelists whose names you'll see down below. And we do have everyone's full bios available on our website, so you can head there if you want to learn more about these fine folks. I'll let them kind of introduce themselves as they get rolling, so we don't take up too much time right now. Just want to say a few quick words here. We wish that we could be holding this summit with you in person and this panel with you in person. We are, like everyone else, kind of adjusting to this virtual format. But the silver lining is it does allow for a lot more people to get access to these panels and to get access to every single panel if they wish. We do have one every single Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. You can check out the lineup on our website between now and September when we will have kind of a half-day plenary. That half-day plenary is September 25th, and it will feature Scott Spencer of Smart Growth America and the Annie Casey Foundation, along with award-winning columnist E.J. Dion of the Washington Post and Brookings Institution. It'll also have some other discussions, some right now surprise guests because we haven't announced too much yet. So stay tuned on that. But that'll be kind of the big day. So we'll have webinars leading up to that big day. And of course, we couldn't be doing this without these wonderful sponsors. So we thank you. We send a thank you to all these sponsors right here. For all of our planning professionals, all of our webinars have been approved for one AICP credit. You can just log on to the AICP website and fill out their info to claim that. Couple housekeeping things. I'm going to hand it off to Scott Wolf momentarily. He will be at the end of the session running the Q&A session that we'll have. And at any time during the panel, though, you don't have to wait till the end. You can use the Q&A function here in Zoom and submit a question, and we'll get to it at the very end. This session is being recorded, and it will be made available to everyone who's registered pretty shortly, and it will be made available publicly, I think, after our that September 25th event. So with that, I think that's all I need to say, and I will hand it off to you, Scott.
CJ, thanks very much. And thanks to all our dynamic panelists and responders, and to all of you in the audience. My name is Scott Wolf. I'm Executive Director of Grow Smart Rhode Island. And we're obviously living in very challenging and times, uncharted waters, whatever phrase you want to use. This discussion today is occurring against the backdrop of a public health, economic, and racial justice crisis. And I think this kind of crisis atmosphere makes it more important than ever to learn, to listen to and learn from the kind of cutting edge community and economic development thought leaders that we've been able to assemble today. And we're going to be talking a lot about TOD, transit-oriented development, and its relationship to housing, its ability to catalyze more affordable workforce housing. And TOD is still not a universally accepted practice by a long shot. I'm hoping and anticipating that the stirring underway now in response to all we've been through for innovative ideas, for different approaches, may actually strengthen the prospects for progress in implementing TOD in Rhode Island, provided that we're strategic and deliberate in approaching it. The state's transit master plan that some of you, most of you hopefully are aware of, is one that we ensured it got off the ground a few years ago. And that may also be a catalyst once it's released, and we hope it will get released soon, for moving TOD forward in Rhode Island. It has a lot of proposals to do that. Beyond our strong push for the transit master plan, Grow Smart Rhode Island in 2018 partnered with Housing Works Rhode Island and Roger Williams University to produce a study of the opportunities for transit-oriented development in 5 communities across the state. Woonsocket, North Kingstown, South Kingstown, Westerly, and Newport's North End. Those are certainly not the only places where TOD is a real viable prospect. Obviously, Pawtucket, Central Falls, Warwick, and Providence are other major opportunity areas. But they had their act so together in terms of research and consulting capacity that they didn't need to take part in our study. This morning, we've got a very talented panel of housing, economic development, and planning thought leaders and practitioners. We also have two very savvy city councilors to react to our panel's thoughts about how best to incent private, commercial, and residential development near transit hubs. Our first panelist will be Annette Bourne, who's a distinguished GrowSmart RI alumnus and currently the Research and Policy Director of Housing Works Rhode Island. Annette's going to give us a brief overview of the potential synergy between TOD and efforts to expand affordable and workforce housing opportunities. Next in the lineup is Nate Kelly, a veteran, accomplished community development planner and consultant, serving currently as the principal at the highly respected planning and environmental consulting firm Horsley Witten. Nate will be providing us an insider's perspective on the plans underway for TOD in 5 communities along the Providence-Boston MBTA commuter rail line. And our final panelist is Ted Carmen, the president of Boston-based Concord Square Planning and Development. Ted is a leading regional planner and developer with a specialization in redevelopment finance and TOD. He's currently deeply engaged in TOD efforts in nearby Brockton, Mass, and is the principal author of a major Massachusetts policy reform that encourages equitable TOD around the Commonwealth. Ted will be outlining a number of the key tools, organizations, and structures that are necessary to optimize effective and equitable TOD. We're also privileged to have 2 dynamic city councilors, as I mentioned before, to react to today's panel presentation. Pawtucket City Councilor Megan Coleman and Providence City Councilor Nerva LaFortune. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Nerva. Both of these local leaders have demonstrated a keen interest in affordable housing and improved public transportation. Following the panel presentations and the responses from the city councilors, there'll be time for me and for you folks to pose questions to the panelists. And you can do this by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So with that, I want to turn it over to Annette to begin panel presentations.
Good morning, Scott. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who was assembled. I am going to share my screen and PowerPoint here. I'm hoping everyone can see that. So as Scott said, I am the Research and Policy Director for Housing Works Rhode Island. We are a community partner of Roger Williams University. We publish each year a housing fact book. For those of you who don't know, we really take a deeper dive into housing affordability across the state and its relationships to economic development and the outcomes of health and education, issue briefs, other sorts of research. Please check out our website. This year, our release will be virtual on October 16th. So please hop on by and learn more about us. I'm going to start by just trying to make that linkage that Scott was mentioning between housing affordability and work. Our incomes across the state vary widely. The Housing Fact Book, which you see here featuring Pawtucket, Providence, and Warwick, give you a baseline of all of the facts that you need to know about any municipality, as well as a state overview. Within this column on the right, the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training puts out an biannual State of the State overview. As you can see, Pawtucket, not unusual that nearly 30% of the people in Pawtucket actually travel to Massachusetts for work, whereas in Providence, many people are able to find jobs within Providence, whereas in Warwick, even 57% still travel to other places. So what does this tell us? This tells us that housing is connected in many ways to all facets of our life. Sometimes these are referred to as the social determinants of health. They are also called the social and environmental determinants of health. We see housing as a real axle to all of the outcomes in life. It's become common knowledge now that your zip code is more predictive of your life outcomes than your actual genetic code. Reasons include whether you live next to a highway and breathe effluent every day, or whether you go to a school that is not actually credentialed. So the reasons are myriad, and we try to take a look at these through the Housing Fact Book and our issue briefs throughout the year. Another key factor of what is going on is how does transportation costs combine with your housing costs in order to allow you to afford the other things you need in life, your groceries, your medicines. The H&T index explains that you should have no more than 45% of your household budget consumed by both of these. We see in this example that Warwick actually is at 66%. That's in a typical household. It is not a specific thing, but this is something that we concern ourselves here in Rhode Island because our housing costs are already, we know that more than half of our renters, for example, are already cost burdened. This is an example of how these cost burdens actually play out in our fastest growing occupations here. Another helpful resource from the Rhode Island Department of Labor and Training. Of our 10 fastest growing occupations here, and this is from 2018, only 3 of them would pay enough for the out of reach income of $20.86, which is what the National Low Income Housing Coalition would suggest that is needed for a 2-bedroom rent here in the state. We take a little bit of a deeper dive here, and you can still see though that a majority of these occupations as a 1-person occupation would not be paying that 2-person rent nor achieving a mortgage. And one thing I just want to point out, all of this is workforce housing. Workforce housing, unfortunately these days, includes our emergency shelters. So going to my next slide, best practices for housing affordability and TODs. We suggest to use an equity lens with transit-oriented development. That means really looking at who already lives in the area. Who are those stakeholders? Can we provide for affordability to reach the people who already live there? Avoiding gentrification and displacement, revitalizing so that everybody benefits. One of the tools that we have seen to use for this is a community benefits agreement, although I have to say that it is not a slam dunk. Making sure that these things are adhered to, making sure that it is local people who are actually getting the jobs in the area is something that needs to be watched closely. So again, if you want to learn more about us, please visit our website. We are active on social media and happy to entertain questions later on. Thank you very much.
Annette, thank you very much. Let's now turn to Nate Kelly.
All right, thanks a lot, Scott, and thank you very much, Ann. Let me see if I can do the technological wizardry here. Okay, are folks seeing this? Okay, so as Scott mentioned in the introduction, I was asked to be on this panel just to sort of give a regional look at what's going on. As someone who works in consulting, I get the the opportunity, the privilege to work with a lot of communities on this particular corridor that you're seeing here on the screen. So if you type into your web browser that I want to take a train from Providence to South Station, this is the picture that comes up for you. It shows you the route through all of these different communities headed north that a lot of people are taking to maybe commute out of our state, and wouldn't be better if they were commuting back into our state for work. Part of that jobs housing relationship that Annette discussed. And so what I wanted to do was to just either based on the experience that my firm has or just do some other research on this area, give you a snapshot of some of the TOD efforts that are happening here. And the first thing that we sort of realized out of the gate is that for the purposes of this discussion, we're not going to talk about the market inside Route 95 and Route 128. This is sort of a different world economically. So for example, the city of Newton right now is looking at permitting about 800 units of new development around TOD, which is just, it's hard for some of us in Rhode Island to imagine what that might look like, even as much as we might like it for some of our more urban areas. So I stayed away from that area in terms of the summary and looked in between Route 128 and the Rhode Island line. And this is the collection of stations that you see. You've got 6 of them on that main purple line that we looked at, and then there's a spur that you'll notice towards the top that goes from Canton into Stoughton that has another 2 stations on that. And when you look at all of these stations, these 8 stations here, 5 out of the 8 of these really do have an aggressive, intentional, transit-oriented development program initiative. And it's interesting to see they're at various levels of implementation. So sort of starting from the north, moving south, in Canton, despite their proximity to Route 128, they are still in the early planning phases. And so we worked with them on their community master plan, what we call in Rhode Island a comprehensive plan. And one of the interesting elements in here is that where you might have elements around housing and transportation and economic development, this master plan, we decided to do a specific element on a place on Canton Junction, which is going to be their TOD focus. So we were able to look at the blend of economic development and housing and equity and transportation within one of the single elements of the master plan. And this sort of led to a further study where you see that word equitable, as Annette mentioned, equitable transit-oriented developments, where the community really does recognize that this is a key piece. The housing piece in particular is incredibly important to them to try to achieve some of their equity objectives within the community. So with these 2 documents, they have a really detailed, the detail is being an important piece of that policy framework for zoning, infrastructure, management, and so that includes things like parking and government-owned lands, state-owned lands, and the MBTA, and those partnerships that are going to be really key to implementing a successful TOD program. The market here, as you can imagine, is incredibly strong. So we think that despite everything happening now with COVID, this is an area that is going to flourish in the very near future. On Stoughton, further down that spur, they have looked at their downtown area. This is their downtown, and used their redevelopment authority and the urban renewal planning initiative to set, again, a very strong policy framework. Probably more than any other community in which I've worked, zoning is the largest barrier in this setting. We think that the market demand is there. We think that the infrastructure is there. There's been public investment in the right-of-way and street level improvements, and the zoning is really a mess. So we're working with them now aggressively to head towards an autumn adoption. And the developers are, the property owners and developers are in the queue waiting for these improvements to take place on the regulatory scale. Back on the main spur in Mansfield, this is a community that's probably farther along than most, in the sense that there's plenty of housing and mixed use that's already been built with their one Mansfield apartments in place, 80 units, and another 100 units with 300 Main Street on the way. This is not a community that we've had the opportunity with which to work, but you know, looking at the news and culling through the documents that they have, you know, we noticed that as they head to town meeting this year, where they were where you adopt zoning in Massachusetts, you know, they were just going to make some modest changes. It seems that they like what they have in terms of their TOD, and they're just continuing to refine that to try to respond, whether it's to any unintended roadblocks or just to make some improvements to the zoning that they have. They're bringing that forward and moving in a positive direction. One of the things that was interesting to notice with this community are the peripheral developments. So they've had a number of multifamily housing developments that have been outside sort of the official TOD district. So even a little bit further out than one might consider to be, you know, comfortable walking distance, sort of pushing that boundary a little bit. The pressure there and the market viability and the opportunity that they've opened up through zoning has led to sort of these more peripheral developments that are just contributing to that access to transit on the commuter rail. And then further south, as we get closer to the Rhode Island border here in Attleboro, some of you may have seen presentations on this in previous GrowSmart events, but Attleboro has really done a tremendous job with their train station, working with the state as a partner on some very important infrastructure investments that help to unlock the development potential of some of these parcels here. So right now they've got about 330 plus units directly in the pipeline for this area. And I think one of the things that really speaks to the power of this particular planning department, can't say enough about them, is the diversity of projects here. So these aren't the only 3 projects that I've circled on the screen, but these are a few of the key ones. And you can see to the left, it's brand new development with the Renaissance Phase 1. And then to the right, 2 very different adaptive reuse projects, buildings in different states of viability or disrepair, and using all different sorts of incentives and subsidies and you know, tools to get these different types of projects off the ground. So a really diverse setting in terms of the types of buildings and the sites and the developments that they're putting together. And then finally, just as a, you know, maybe a prelude to your next presenter here with Ted, just introducing the Pawtucket Central Falls Conant Thread District. So this is a pretty fresh effort in Rhode Island. It's the first sort of it's a district that straddles 2 communities, Central Falls and Pawtucket, and created the first joint planning commission in the state that has joint regulatory review over certain types of projects. So working out the details of who reviews what at what level and what location is something that the 2 cities took their time to go through and really did, I think, a fantastic job of you know, creating a strong TOD framework that can allow for tremendous levels of either new development or adaptive reuse. So it's a very interesting model, and we'll see how that moves forward. And I will stop there because I know Ted is going to speak to us a little bit more about the details of this particular setting.
Nate, thank you very much. A lot of good food for thought. I know Ted's going to provide some additional food for thought and some great lessons from his battle-scarred experience over the years in this field. So Ted, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks very much. Hello, everybody. I've spent decades working in gateway cities in Massachusetts, places like North Adams and Pittsfield, Springfield, Worcester, Brockton. I've spent decades working on smart growth issues, particularly the Chapter 40R smart growth zoning that provides incentives for communities to put smart growth in place. And I've spent decades in finance doing multiple projects in the gateway cities using state and historic tax credits, the new market tax credits, et cetera. And the report out of all of that is that it's still extraordinarily difficult to get new housing built in the gateway city kind of communities. In Newton, it's one thing. In places like Worcester and Fitchburg, it's another because the rents are a lot lower. But consequently, when I learned 6 or 7 months ago about what Pawtucket is doing and what the opportunities are at the Conant Thread District, I was really fascinated by it because it looks like there's an opportunity in Pawtucket that doesn't exist anywhere else in New England in terms of the super TIF. So I'm thrilled to be here today to be talking with you about it and what it looks like from that point of view. What you see is a vision plan for the Conant Thread District in Pawtucket. And the idea is that there will be a new rail station. There is already in place a super TIF. There's over 1 million square feet of existing mill buildings. There's vacant land. So there's potential here for hundreds of units of housing, and there's potential for thousands of square feet of new office and commercial space. Next slide, please. I think let's talk about the coronavirus. The exceptional transit locations of the Rhode Island areas won't change. Their long-term trends towards urbanization may be modified, and I think a lot of people are thinking with all this isolation and people working at homes that there may be some major changes in the future, but probably the long-term trends are not going to change direction very much. The innovation economy is going to continue to gravitate to places like Boston and Providence, and high tech is always going to reward teamwork, which an awful lot of experience indicates is improved by proximity. And I should say that the TOD potential in Rhode Island is not just Pawtucket, because there are 4 or 5 or 6 other stations, Providence, Warwick, Kingston, et cetera, that all have the potential for doing what Pawtucket is already underway with. So let's go to the next slide, if you please. And I think one of the most impressive things about Pawtucket and other communities, for instance, Brockton has a very strong vision plan for its downtown, but this is the vision plan for the Conant Thread District. The lighter buildings are existing buildings. The darker buildings are potential new construction. So people have really thought about, and the community has really thought about, what could we do here with a new train station that's only 40 minutes from downtown Boston? Next slide. And in addition to that vision plan, they've also implemented design guidelines, which would be used to make sure that what gets built has the quality, the aesthetic quality, the placemaking quality, the quality that makes people want to be there and to have shops and a variety of urban experience. So in fact, it's well in place in Pawtucket, and any community that's thinking about TOD should probably also have design guidelines. Next slide. But the real point is that no developer can build housing without deep, deep subsidies in these gateway cities, because the market rents in these TOD locations are not high enough to support the cost of new or renovated buildings, new buildings or renovated buildings. So nothing is being produced at the moment. And even with all the vision plans and the design standards, not much will happen unless there's a new financing tool. And what's tremendously exciting about Rhode Island is that they've passed a super TIF for the Conant Thread District, which really could be a game changer. It could make it feasible to build both housing and commercial space and get broad neighborhood revitalization in one spot. Let's go to the next slide. A super TIF standing for tax increment financing. It's really a program that deals with the property taxes and the other taxes, property taxes, income taxes that will be generated by new development. And it's a technique to take future taxes and use it to build new projects. This super TIF is now available in the Arts, Growth Center, and Ballpark districts in Pawtucket. So it's in place. The idea is that incremental new state tax revenues would get placed in an account that can be accessed by the redevelopment authority. And the taxes come from business corporations, sales and use tax, and personal income tax. So that means the business taxes that are paid by corporations and other entities in this district would go into a special fund. So would the sales taxes. So would the income taxes of people actually working in the district. Next slide. And what happens is these taxes get deposited into a restricted account, which can be used by the redevelopment authority to pay for debt service on bonds. And the bonds can be sold and used for infrastructure improvements, revolving funds, and building housing and other kinds of improvements. Next page, next one, please. And the authority has broad powers under the super TIF to purchase and redevelop properties, to build streets and parks, to prepare a redevelopment plan, and most significantly, in terms of really developing the area, they can use this money, they can use the bonds to lend money to private entities for private redevelopment projects. That's what's so remarkable, this opportunity to take money that's essentially guaranteed available to pay the debt service on bonds, and the bond proceeds then get lent to the developers. The question is, how do you structure that? Next slide. And actually, A, how do you structure it? But B, how do you get started? And the legislation even allows the existing taxes that are being paid in the district to be used to retain or expand existing businesses, or are necessary to finance or complete a given project. I believe that that means that the taxes that are currently paid by businesses and residents in this district can go into this account and can be used to pay the debt service on bonds that are floated to do either public infrastructure projects or to build private housing or private office space or private retail space. Next slide. So I've been working on this concept in Massachusetts for a number of years. We in fact got legislation passed, but the state has seen fit not to implement the program. But one way this could work is that the bond money that's the debt services paid by these taxes would be used to make subordinated financing to developers. And this money would fill a financing gap, so the shortfall of what's available conventionally. It would be potentially a 30-year zero interest rate loan and secured with a subordinate mortgage. But the developer would be required to pay this back with the cash flow that they get from the project. So it's basically a way for the public to participate in the project's profits over time. Next page. The money could be used for projects that are housing, for commercial, for mixed use. Each one would presumably demonstrate that new incremental tax revenues would equal or exceed the debt service on the bonds. And the redevelopment plan that is set up in the vision statement would set forth the overall objectives. So every project would meet the overall objectives, would meet design standards, et cetera. Next page. The impact of this would be extraordinary because, first of all, public improvements could start people beginning to have confidence in the future of the area. The gap financing makes it possible to do projects based on current rents, and then the redevelopment authority would benefit and get the money back through the profits. presumably developers would line up to do the projects, and the more projects that are built, the more TIF revenues would be available to secure the debt. Next, please. What are the benefits? Each new housing unit would generate new income and sales taxes during construction, during operations indefinitely, and most importantly, as new housing is built, we believe that new permanent jobs would be filled in the broader region that would otherwise remain vacant. Spin-off improvements would happen nearby. I've said several times, profit sharing with the lender means that the profits made by the project go back to the community. And finally, the total benefits based on detailed pro formas and projections we've made would substantially exceed the cost of the debt service on the bonds that are sold to pay for it upfront. Next, please. The potential market is the Rhode Island TOD locations. In other words, this could happen, this could be expanded to not just Pawtucket, but to the other locations where there are train stations. These areas would all be highly desirable to both residential and commercial tenants. And they'd offer lower rents plus a highly attractive place to live and work. And one of the things that's likely to come out of that is that rents in the areas would likely go up over time. And therefore one requirement that might and probably should be included would be but as an option, would be to have 20% of the units affordable for people at 80% of median. Next, please. The background for this is based on a really very interesting academic paper by two authors, Shea and Moretti, called Why Cities Matter, that was written in May of 2015 and recently updated. They evaluated 220 market areas in the United States for 45 years, and they determined the levels of total factor productivity, housing supply elasticity, and the extent of housing regulations. And the finding was basically that places like the greater Boston area, New York, San Francisco, and I think that extends down to Providence, are places where job creation is substantially hindered by the lack of housing. So if more housing is built, more jobs get created. And one of their conclusions was if housing constraints, in other words, the zoning that's stopping things in Stoughton, had changed, that 20% of the population would have moved to these areas during the last 45 years. Next slide, please. And that led us to do an analysis that bottom line ended up showing that if 1,000 new housing units get built in the greater Boston area, it allows 1,100 permanent new jobs to be filled that would otherwise remain vacant. This is pretty remarkable because when you do a cost benefit to the state on those numbers, basically the state would get back $5 for every dollar of cost in this initial upfront cost. So this is a program that costs a lot of money up front to do something substantial, but over time could return $5 for every dollar that gets spent. That's the summary. It's I think there's a lot of detail that's been done on it. This kind of a concept could work, but it's a complex proposition and would take a great deal of effort locally in any of these locations to get it underway. Thanks very much. It's really been a pleasure to be able to outline these ideas.
Ted, thank you very much. I think the good news is that in Pawtucket, Central Falls, and in other communities like Providence and Warwick, there are good minds applying themselves to try to use these tools and concepts effectively already. So we'll stay tuned on how that all progresses. Hopefully influence how it progresses. So we've heard a lot of really interesting, provocative, and in some ways inspiring presentations here today. And to help us digest them and analyze them, I'd like to have our two city councilors who are in the trenches dealing with these issues provide a brief response before we go to a broader Q&A discussion. So Councilor Lafortune, would you like to give us some of your preliminary thoughts about what you've heard?
Thank you so much, Scott and Growth Smart RI, for inviting me to this very informative and much needed session. Thank you, Annette, Nate, and Ted for your expertise. And it's wonderful to see, I always joke and say my partner in crime, Megan Kalman, who lives literally down the road from me, but in Pawtucket. It's great to see her and hopefully hear her wisdom and input on this. We all know that right here in Rhode Island, we have a significant shortage of housing, particularly affordable housing. And I think, and it outlined, it illustrated quite well where we find in the Housing Fact Book that housing, economic opportunity, education, health, they're all aligned. In fact, John Friedman, a few years ago, with some other researchers, put together an atlas, and it's an outcome atlas. And basically what it did is it determined, it predicted, your life outcome based on your zip code. And so I input my zip code growing up in Providence, which was 02907 before my family moved to 02905, which is still South Side, but a little further up in Washington Park. But in that area, we had green space because our street went into Roger Williams Park. But where I grew up, my life outcome as a Black woman was at the very bottom. I realized during that time that although we were between two major corridors, there wasn't as much economic opportunity. We were in a food desert, so there wasn't a supermarket. We did not have access to safe housing. I'm a survivor of lead poison. And I also think about my own ward right now and looking at North Main Street, which is an underdeveloped or underutilized corridor. It has one of the highest transit line in the state of Rhode Island. And yet there's a lot of open space, parking lots, buildings that are not being utilized right now. There are developers who are land banking. And yet we see development happening in Pawtucket. There's the new train station, that they're developing right now. We have close access to I-95, and then you have the R line. So there needs to be more investment in developing those area. One, we can include inclusionary zoning where you have commercial space as well as residential space. It allows people, particularly those who are, working families and working individuals, or an opportunity to develop workforce housing, because what can happen is rather than invest funding in a car, if you're close to an area where transportation is easily accessible, then it makes it much easier to get to work. You can have access to transportation, and you develop these communities and these very diverse communities. So our state has struggled and has not truly invested in affordable housing or workforce housing. And in fact, the state of Rhode Island, I believe, invests less than $10 per person on housing. And yet Massachusetts invests, I believe, about $99 per person. So that's a significant gap. And we see how partnerships have worked in Central Falls, Pawtucket, the development that's happening in Massachusetts. One thing I will say, Nate brought up urban development that's taken, urban renewal plans that's happening in Stoughton. One challenge with urban renewal is that it also has caused gentrification. And there are certainly pros and cons in developing communities, but we also need to consider who are the people who are living in the communities and how do we ensure that there is housing opportunities there for those who are either underemployed and unemployed. We also need to look at housing and affordable housing. We have to, I think, look at it from two tiers. I was surprised to hear that even homeless shelters are under that category, which is quite problematic. And there should be a tier for affordable housing or workforce housing, and then there should be a tier for low income housing. Because if you're not receiving any type of income, or if you're homeless or underemployed, there should be a tier for that. But I think what we focused on lately is more affordable housing, but not really considering those who are not generating any type of income on a monthly basis. And so I do plan to read that report that Ted stated, but our state has to do more in investing in affordable housing, looking at our high transit corridors and figuring out how can we work collaboratively with other cities so that we can invest in these communities. Just like Central Falls and Pawtucket's planning department have collaborated, I think it would be important for Providence to collaborate with Pawtucket as well as Cranston, because the R line runs all the way to the border of Cranston. We should also think about how can we generate some more tax revenue so that we can invest in more housing projects. And for many developers that I've spoken to, what they say is there's no real return in investment because the rents, again, is so low. And we look at the medium income household for Providence, and without including the East Side, it's less than $40,000 per year, which also means that there aren't jobs for people. And during the presentation, it was stated that in the report that developers will invest in, will see more housing, or developers will invest in areas, or jobs, will come into areas where there is housing opportunity. So what this pandemic also has showed us is that our community needs jobs. We need to invest more in our marginalized communities. We need to provide folks with opportunities. But if we're not investing in housing, we're failing. It's a failure to some of our most vulnerable community members. We're not creating economic opportunities for them, and their life outcomes will be poor, and it's quite problematic. So thank you for this opportunity to sit on this panel and provide some feedback. But what this reminds us is that we need to invest in housing, and we need to think about where we're developing these housing opportunities and really look at our high transit corridors because those areas are underutilized, and it would be the most fiscally responsible area I see to invest in terms of developing affordable housing, because it benefits everyone.
Thank you very much, Nerva. Great points. And I want to make a quick point about the need for more affordable housing and workforce housing in Rhode Island. The governor, to her credit, has proposed a $25 million affordable housing bond, which I hope still can get put on the ballot this November. She's also proposed for the first time, I think ever, a line item in the normal state budget for housing. That may be a bigger lift this year, but it's a worthy objective, and hopefully, if not this year, in the near future, that can happen as well. On to Megan for your perspective.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm Megan Coleman. I'm a city councilor in Pawtucket. My own experience of housing insecurity as a child is a big driver of my interest in these issues. And also it's a big issue for my community, the district that I represent. So Pawtucket's median income is $44,000 a year, which puts home ownership and indeed even just safe and affordable housing out of reach of many of us. So I feel like this moment, and I'm really grateful to this panel because there's so many, we are talking about the financing mechanisms, we're talking about the zoning mechanisms, like all of that is a piece of the pie. And for me, this is an opportunity as a collaborative crew of thinkers and doers to make a really justice-based series of decisions about development and about housing. So as Nira has said, and Ted's point in Ted's presentation also emphasized this, that housing, I think, is the best investment that we can make, right? There's research that suggests you build the housing, the jobs come. But I would also go further and say that failing to invest in good housing, including significant affordable housing, is a form of classism and it's a form of racism. Because when you look at who doesn't have access to housing, right, it falls down on class and race lines primarily, a little bit of gender too. And so to not take this seriously, like that's not okay, right? That's injustice and that's systemic, right? So to me, the biggest issue here is inclusion. So Pawtucket is we're doing a lot of work to try to expand the tax base, which would bring the revenues in the city higher. And that's really important concern. But development has to be inclusive, right? We're living in what they're calling the worst era of inequality since the Gilded Age. Housing is obviously a determinant of lots of other things, as we've seen from Annette's presentation, health, success in schools, et cetera. So, but an equity lens, I think, means real inclusion of the community. So like, my point here is that this has to be a process that includes community input. And, I'm a professional, Nira's a professional, everybody on this panel is professionals. We have a lot of experience, we're good at what we do, but we have to remember that there are some, that part of the work is listening to the community's vision about what they want. And so it makes me happy to see a lot of emphasis on stakeholders. And we need to tackle the needs that we're hearing really explicitly. Community listening sessions are one thing, but actually acting on what we hear is a different thing, right? And that's a really important piece of it. So related, I think it's important to, for Rhode Island especially, because of where we are in our sort of economic development, which is on the upswing and we have a ways to go, we can't use the excuse of the other things that are challenging not to do something on housing, which is partly why I think this work is so exciting. So yes, housing is linked to general economic health, but we can start to break that cycle of economic health by investing in housing now. And this again goes to Ted's point, right? Research suggests that the jobs will follow. And this is again, like the best investment that we can make. And so I think there's a really awesome role for active planning and active public engagement. And we've spent a lot of time sort of thinking on this panel about building collaborative relationships with developers. Which is obviously incredibly important, right? Because the money just doesn't work for most developers. And that's part of the responsibility of good public entities, is to try to help figure out a way to make the money work so that you guys can build the housing. It's also my belief that we have to engage these new financing tools like TIFs or tax stabilization agreements, they call those TSAs, while also really ensuring a community benefit, right? So to me, that's one of the strongest arguments for something like an inclusionary zoning where, X% of the new housing that's built includes affordable units or so. There's a great project coming up in Pawtucket. Alison Bologna's project is a really, really wonderful example in this regard, which I think is actually over 30% affordable housing. So inclusionary zoning is awesome. And I also just want to plug that one of the other things that really moves me about that is that mixed income developments are good because it blends people of different socioeconomic status. This has really good consequences for everything from like transit infrastructure to schools, et cetera. And it also leads me to this point that Scott just made about needing a consistent stream of money for affordable housing from the state, right? Like that is one of those things that like the state, I think it's part of the state's responsibility to look at that. A few more things that just stood out to me listening to these presentations. It's clear to me that we need to also embrace density right now because of the nature of transit-oriented development, because of the nature of Providence and Pawtucket. We're developed, so a lot of the building that we are doing is redeveloping. But COVID has also really shown us that we need to prioritize parks and green spaces. So nothing like being shut in your house for however long without enough outside space. So it makes me excited about the possibilities of something like a super TIF. To sort of rethink our green spaces relative to the density of housing. And I want to wind up by saying like transit-oriented development in principle to me is also really wonderful, partly because of like all the economic benefits that have been outlined here, but also because of the climate and the environment ones, right? Pawtucket relies very heavily on buses and transit because of who our community is. The R line, which is the most heavily used line in the state, runs right through my district. It's actually the bus line that I take to get to work when I am actually going to work rather than working at home. But I think there's some like significant climate benefits and significant like walkability, sort of urban culture and life benefits, as well as accessibility benefits. And I think our tendency is sometimes to pull these issues apart. But they're all part of the same thing, right? Like that's what makes a vibrant city community is seeing these all as different faces of like the same gemstone, if you will, to use a very weird metaphor. But thanks for the time, and I'm curious to hear from folks who've been listening in. So I'll stop right there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead, Norma. Yep.
No, I was just going to add to Megan's point. She mentioned earlier around inclusionary zoning. I actually introduced which is still in committee, a residential TSA, which would require development, any developer who's developing residential units or any type of residential development would have to allocate a certain percentage, exactly what Megan said, of their units to affordable housing, which is what's being done in New York, and as well as I believe in Boston. And I also proposed last August at a national conference a plan for transit-oriented development, which is very similar to what Growth Smart has done. And I know the city has also published a few reports, but really focusing on honing in on the North Main Street corridor. And you're right. When you're walking down that street, there isn't any green space, it's all concrete. And we really need to look at it from an equity lens and to think about the population of people we're serving, the community that we're serving, and also what are the things that we need to do to create housing opportunities as well as job opportunities, and also create areas where families can work, live, and thrive.
Well said. So we do have some time for Q&A and discussion. I want to ask one or two questions, and then I know we have at least one question already from the audience. I encourage others to write down their questions in the Q&A box, so to speak. There's been a lot of talk by a number of you about zoning, both inclusionary zoning and I think at least reference to some other zoning issues. My sense is that one of the challenges in getting TOD off the ground in Rhode Island is resistance to allowing the number of units around a train station that will make it economically feasible for a developer to invest in that kind of multifamily housing. Does anybody, either the counselors or the panelists, want to comment a little bit about that? Nate, you referenced zoning being a particularly thorny barrier to Stoughton's vision for TOD. Maybe you want to give us a minute on elaborating on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a number of people have talked about market issues, and I think that's, you know, a big part of the puzzle here. So it's really interesting to look at all the different stops, for example, on the train line that I was looking at earlier. So the housing market in Canton, for example, is probably stronger and more expensive than anything that we have in Rhode Island, in a suburban type community. Whereas Stoughton and Attleboro, you probably can find comparable communities in Rhode Island. And then you look at, for example, the differences between North Kingstown and Warwick and Pawtucket Central Falls, extremely different sort of micro markets there. So, I mean, I think the takeaway for me is that it's very different, but I find it hard I cannot find an example where some level of subsidy is not going to be needed. So whether it's in a more affluent community like North Kingstown, they put their train station on top of their drinking water aquifer. And so the answer to that, in order to unlock density, the answer to that is going to be infrastructure in the form of probably advanced wastewater treatment. So that plaza can continue to plod along with the Walmart and the stores that they have there. Just keep doing what it's doing, and you're never going to achieve that TOD vision until you do something on the technology and the engineering side, which would require some kind of subsidy. And then you look at Pawtucket Central Falls and those gigantic historic structures, the cost around renovating those compared with the rents, the pro forma just doesn't work without some kind of subsidy package associated with that. Ted talked about that, I think, nicely. So I don't think, this isn't Newton, Massachusetts, where there is no subsidy involved and 800 units are, blasting into place. We're in a different spot in terms of the market. Regionally, the market's very strong, but from town to town, city to city, there are some key differences here. So some level of state cooperation, state incentive, local incentive is always going to be required, and it's case by case. It's going to be different.
I want to talk, I agree with you fully. I want to talk about two subsidies that I would call them investments rather than subsidies per se, because I think the return is greater than the cost to the taxpayers that we've been advocating. One is a Rhode Island municipal infrastructure grant program that would give communities some funding to enhance the infrastructure that's necessary to catalyze economic development. One of the projects you referenced in Attleboro was made possible by a program of that sort, a municipal infrastructure grant program of that sort in Massachusetts. And we lack funding for that kind of program right now. We've got the skeleton, the framework for a municipal infrastructure grant program on the books in Rhode Island, but no funding yet. So we're pushing hard for that. And a second is we, right now in Rhode Island, unfortunately, have very few funds available to incentivize historic rehab, adaptive reuse. We were a national leader in incenting historic rehab not too long ago, but the funds have dried up, both for the state historic tax credit program, which fortunately is still on the books at least, and through Rebuild Rhode Island, which has improved and which has become more user-friendly for historic rehab, but doesn't have much funding left to deploy. So we are trying to get more resources from the state to incent historic rehab, as well as to incent affordable housing and to incent infrastructure investment that will catalyze and make more feasible promising economic development projects, often TOD oriented. Let's look at questions from the audience here. And so first one I have here is from Liza Birkin. Is there any discussion of inclusionary zoning legislation at the state level? Would anybody like to handle that? Annette?
So inclusionary zoning is really a local tool to deal with the local ordinances. It overlays whatever your baseline is. Unfortunately, where it's adopted in Rhode Island, it primarily deals with major subdivisions. So you are already limiting yourself to single family development. Where the state plays a role is in enabling the use of inclusionary zoning and certain tools within inclusionary zoning, like fee and lieu. Our major cities, unfortunately, right now have been resistant, and I understand the concern. They feel that this is a put off to private developers. I think they feel that if they incent enough development, it will kind of take care of the market in general. Being a housing exile from the greater Boston area, and remembering Somerville when it had a less enjoyable nickname to it, and knowing now what it costs to live there, I don't know that our elected officials in Providence and Pawtucket maybe can foresee how expensive these communities can become if we really get past, this crisis that we're in right now. In terms of, establishing a baseline of where rents are right now in order to really better understand what that curve begins to look like as they increase. But inclusionary zoning as a tool could definitely be bolstered in some of the communities that are currently using it. And it's not going to solve all of these problems.
Yeah.
But it could help. Ted, go ahead.
It could help.
With your thoughts.
I'd just like to say that if you're in a situation where the numbers basically don't work to develop new housing. If you require inclusionary zoning, nothing gets built unless you provide the subsidy to pay for the rents that are lost from the deal.
Mhm.
So the requirement of inclusionary zoning may well mean that no housing gets built as opposed to some housing getting built. That's number one. Number two, the structure that I outlined for the super TIF would be a way to make that happen. In other words, it says the gap financing would be filled by a long-term interest-free loan. If you provided that financing to a deal, then it would be very easy to require inclusionary zoning as well because you've provided a way to pay for it. Another comment about zoning is that we found in Massachusetts that almost all the gateway cities are very happy to have more density. And many of them have passed Chapter 40R, which itself requires 20% affordable housing. Where you end up with the problem with zoning is where it's more of a suburban location where the train is. So you don't have density now, and people have a hard time imagining density, and that's a much more difficult zoning issue when you're in that situation.
Good points, Ted. I see a comment from Buff Chase that I think reinforces what you were just saying, Ted, which is inclusionary zoning really is not feasible in Rhode Island without more incentives. So I think you and Buff, both experienced developers, are are in sync on that. There's another question.
I think, but the thing that's really important to keep in mind is that the structure of the super TIF that now is just in Pawtucket, but could be in other locations, really addresses that problem on multiple levels. You know, if that can be robustly implemented, you're going to make a huge change. And there's an opportunity there, particularly with the design standards, to build places that are just extraordinary places for people to live. I mean, live and work. That's the opportunity. And I think the super TIF is unique in New England, actually maybe in the country in terms of it. You have the tools today legislatively to make something extraordinary happen in the state.
Well, that's inspiring, and hopefully it builds our self-confidence. Another, I would point out that Central Falls also is the first community in New England to adopt a green and complete streets ordinance, something that CJ on our staff especially was quite involved in. So when we put our heads together here in Rhode Island, we can be at the front of the parade and being innovative. Another question here from Rex. Are any cities and towns in Rhode Island collecting data on gentrification and the resulting displacement? And then he adds, how are Pawtucket and Central Falls taking that into account with their transportation improvements? So my sense is maybe a few of you might want to respond to that.
Before I address that, I want to just give some time to Nerva. I know she needs to leave and she's been trying to get in.
Oh, thank you, Annette. No, I was just going to make a comment about the last in response to the last question. In fact, the Rhode Island Comprehensive Plan requires that 10% of development is allocated to affordable housing. But it's interesting because gateway cities is 20%. And I do think that percentage has to increase when we look at the medium income household and the population of people that we're serving in our municipalities as well in our state overall. So there is a requirement, but I think that we need to increase that mark a bit more.
Good point. All right. Another question from Octavian Gonzalez. Are there newsletters people can register for to stay up to date about zoning legislation and projects relating to them in Rhode Island? Folks have thoughts on that?
So two newsletters to be aware of that could help with this. One is from Rhode Island Statewide Planning. So they have a newsletter, and I'll embarrass myself by not knowing how frequent it is, but it's fairly regular.
I think it's monthly.
Yeah, and so that is one newsletter that you can find. Again, it's Rhode Island Statewide Planning that may have updates There is also the Rhode Island chapter of the American Planning Association, Rhode Island APA. They have a website, they have a legislative committee, and they have a weekly newsletter that could also provide, some updates, relevant updates on either state level legislation initiatives or things that are happening on the local level.
Great. I'm looking to see if I've missed any questions here. I don't think so. I have one or two more. I realize we're getting close to the witching hour, but I think we have about 5 more minutes. There was a few of you referenced kind of in passing the possibility that there's going to be more remote working in response to COVID-19. Certainly in the short run, there is more remote working, as basically that's what we're all doing today. So how could a significant increase in remote working affect the design and the focus of TODs and their ultimate success? Wondering if folks have any thoughts about that. Would it be a plus, a minus, or would it sort of change how we need to view TODs? Megan?
So I'm not particularly prepared to speak on this from a developer's perspective because I'm not a developer, but I do think that transit, whether people are commuting less or not, is the way of the future. It also, I mean, it has to be. We're nearing the end of the time and space that we can keep building, more transit infrastructure that is not mass transit oriented. So while we may see a big drop off in commuting generally, I don't think it's going to be enough to sort of invalidate the concept of transit oriented development, if that was the question. So that would be my sense. I also wanted to respond. There was a couple of things about Ted made a point about, the inclusionary zoning is cost prohibitive, and somebody in the chat threw up something similar. Yes, it is. That's why we need a dedicated funding stream, right? Like that's what I mean when I say there needs to be investment in this. I say that meaning that the state particularly, but also cities, need to figure out a way to make that funding work. And whether that happens through inclusionary zoning or through a different mechanism is I think that's up for debate in different places at different times. But you're absolutely right when you say the funding doesn't work, that's why it's a non-starter. And part of the job of the governments right now, right, both municipal and state level, I would submit, is to figure out a way to make that funding work. That's the work. Okay. I just want to make sure that was clear, because
it's a chicken and egg problem.
Chatter in the chat about it, and I believe that that's the responsibility of the moment.
Right.
Well,
I would say remote working could be very helpful to Rhode Island, because I think people are learning from this that they don't have to be in Boston.
That's right.
Now, they may want to be in Boston once a week, so that means you could locate a small high-tech company in Pawtucket or in Warwick or in Providence and still have the connection to Boston. Boston is going to always, long-term, going to be the center of all this, of the economy, the high-tech, the hospitals, the medical, etc. But if your company doesn't have to be in Boston every day, they could be in Pawtucket. And if you make a great environment for people to live in Pawtucket or in Warwick or around these train stations, then the rents will be lower than Greater Boston. Then that's how to pull jobs into Rhode Island.
Ted, I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, I spoke with our state treasurer about this, and I don't think just Boston. I actually think even New York, because we're in close proximity. And I think this pandemic is going to cause people to leave these major cities where the cost of living is so high, and to perhaps move into areas that they can still get that city feel, but in a smaller environment. And I think that the state of Rhode Island, particularly Providence, Pawtucket, Central Falls, is well positioned to receive, this wave of new residents. However, we need housing. And if we don't have anywhere for people to live, it's not going to work. So I think this is a great opportunity to truly invest in subsidy programs to encourage developers to build here, and to really look at this city as a place where, yes, you can still work from home, but you can go to New York once or twice a week, or go see a show. I do that often, or Massachusetts, but you can still live and thrive here. But we also need to ensure that whatever, there are some funding that's also going into our schools, because people who are moving into cities are also looking for quality public schools. And that has been a challenge for some of our urban cities right here in the state. So there needs to be an investment in that area as well. But I completely agree with you.
Annette?
So I would just really like to piggyback that by saying, especially if we are talking about building a corridor from New York to Boston, that the people who currently live in these neighborhoods, in Providence, in Pawtucket, I'll throw my own city of Cranston in there, are not displaced by people who are now bringing with them higher incomes than your average Rhode Islander, and skill sets that average Rhode Islanders do not yet have. I'm not saying they can't be obtained, but I'm saying when we talk about the investments that are needed in order to guard against displacement, you need investments that take care of people who are living at 50% and sometimes 30% of median income. A full-time minimum wage worker here in Rhode Island, which includes some of those essential workers right now who are putting their lives on the line to keep grocery store shelves stocked or to keep our grandparents safe in a nursing home, falls at the federal poverty line. That's why I was making a comment that people using the term workforce housing, inferring that is different than affordable housing or low-income housing, this is low-income housing. We have strata across need, and I'm all for thinking about the new economy, but not at the cost of the people who are already suffering from the current economy we have.
But I think we have to be creative and not therefore say, and I think what I'm going to say you would agree with, Annette, and not say we don't do any redevelopment because it's going to price everybody out, but we have to be very strategic and holistic in how we do redevelopment. And I think a number of you today have given us great ideas about how to accomplish that. And I think with that, because we're a little bit over time, I want to thank everybody for very thoughtful and insightful and visionary presentations and comments. And we want this dialogue to continue. I think we're at a time in Rhode Island where, while we have major challenges, the opportunities are greater if we continue to think creatively, strategically, outside the box, and tap into the expertise that you folks have provided us. So I want to thank you. I want to thank the audience, and thank CJ and John, my staff behind the scenes, for making all this possible. And let's continue the dialogue and translate it into action. Thank you all very much.